Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion will be part 3 of an ongoing series focusing on client apps in Microsoft Endpoint Managers. This installment will focus specifically on Windows information protection, and that's specific to Windows. Actually, this one slots right next to a discussion we just had on Microsoft Application Management focused on iOS and Android. This one is the equivalent in this section. It is labeled as MDM, in the console, but specifically the implementation we'll talk about here for Windows of MDM is to use Windows Information Protection. So that's where we're headed. In terms of agenda, what is Windows Information Protection? Why Windows Information Protection matters? Talk about some of the requirements of Windows Information Protection, some few scenarios where Windows Information Protection can be used. We'll walk through configuring Windows Information Protection, and then we'll actually see Windows Information Protection in action. So I'll tell you here that I will show you this working, but the demos will not be as meaningful in my lab as they would be in production, because some of the configurations in my lab are not as easy to do as they would be in a production environment. Maybe that's not the right way to say it. You'll understand as we go through. Troubleshooting tips and tricks to kind of wrap out the session. So what is Windows Information Protection? Well, put simply, it is MDM for Windows, right? So struggle with this a little bit because Windows Information Protection is MDM-like, but it is not MDM, right? There are really two scenarios, and I'll probably mention these a couple of times as we go through. And let's focus on what we just talked about iOS and Android for a minute. To get the controls, to get the, MDM is App Protection Policy in Intune, right? Interchangeable. And so to get the protections in iOS and Android that you might want for the apps themselves must be what are called enlightened. Another way of saying that is you have to have the app specifically written and wrapped, if you will, to enable some of the MDM controls. That is also true when you're using Windows Information Protection without enrollment. However, if you do use Windows Information Protection with enrollment, then there is absolutely no requirement to change the app at all in order to achieve this app protection policy or Windows Information Protection on a Windows device. A Windows device, said another way, Windows Information Protection is built into Windows. And so whatever app is running on Windows, whether it be a 16-bit app, a 32-bit app, a store-based app, whatever it is, if you have the device enrolled, you can achieve the protections that I will show you with Windows Information Protection. But if it's not enrolled, you can still get protections as long as the app itself is enlightened. Hope that makes sense, right? So Windows Information Protection has actually been around a little bit. It's first started as a product called Enterprise Data Protection, or a technology called Enterprise Data Protection. So Windows Information Protection is an evolution of that. Windows Information Protection also makes use of Azure Rights Management to do certain things like protect email attachments or extending protections to data that might leave a device and so on. So data protection is definitely the goal of Windows Information Protection, to help prevent data leakage, to help protect enterprise apps accessing enterprise data. And in terms of devices, we can apply the same set of controls to personal devices, corporate-owned devices, doesn't matter. And a key one, the user experience. So being able to apply controls and protections without interfering with the user experience and making it substantially different. So why Windows Information Protection? Well, first, it is built into Windows. That's why it works with any app, right? As long as the device is enrolled. If the device is not enrolled, then the apps that Windows Information Protection will work with will have to be those enlightened apps. right? So we do have scenarios where Windows Information Protection will work with managed or unmanaged devices. Certainly the managed device experience is a lot more broad, right? Seamless personal corporate data separation. So there's no requirements for employees to switch environments or switch apps. So one example of that in the Android ecosystem, in specifically the work profile configuration, on an Android device, you will have a user that will have 2 copies of a given app. So use Outlook as an example. If you want to protect or use a protected version of Outlook to access corporate data, that app will have to be available in the user's work profile. And then if the user also wants to use Outlook to access personal data, they will have to have an additional copy of Outlook outside of the work profile. Here, that doesn't have to be the case. Any app, you don't have to switch. You don't have to have different apps or different copies of the same app, whatever. Having the ability to wipe corporate data while leaving the personal data intact is really important. Having flexible controls and operational modes. So we're going to dig into this. There's basically 4 ways that you can configure Windows Information Protection. The first one really isn't configuring Windows Information Protection. It's to turn it off, right? Well, if you're going to run Windows Information Protection, you probably don't want to have it turned off, but that is a control. The other is what's called silent. So silent means that your user won't even notice that Windows Information Protection is running. They'll do whatever they do normally, and Windows Information Protection will simply log what has been done. This is a mode that I think of mainly for auditing and or whenever you're first trying to test out a configuration to make sure that it is set correctly before you implement it, and turn on other kind of notifications like allow overrides is another one. You'll see all these in a minute. Allow overrides. So this is how the lab is configured, the deployment to the lab. And what happens here is whenever a user does something that does not align with the way corporate data should be used, the user gets a warning. They can certainly go forward and bypass that warning and take that action anyway, but the user will see that what they're doing is at least something they should consider whether they should continue doing. And then finally, the 4th mode of operation is to block. And what block means is once we have controls set up the way that we want them set up, we're just going to prevent any action that should not take place on corporate data, right? So that's the 4th one. And you'll see those again in a minute. Flexible management. So managing enterprise documents, apps, and encryption modes. Being able to manage copying or downloading of enterprise data. All very, very important things. Being able to protect the apps, being able to manage restrictions, being able to manage encryption at rest. So many ways that we can be flexible in the way that we manage manage these devices as they access corporate data. Okay. So in terms of requirements, right? Windows Information Protection does require Windows 10, 1607 or better. Windows Home is supported if for some reason you want to do that, but know that Windows Home will only support the non-managed operation of a Windows 10 home device. You can't do full MDM enrollment on a home Windows 10 1607 device. So you need Config Manager Intune or a third-party MDM to be able to implement and manage Windows Information Protection. Here we're focusing on Intune because I think that's the better solution for being able to manage Windows Information Protection. So there's 2 modes of operation, as I've already kind of talked about several times, MAM only. And so if you're using MAM only, then you absolutely need Azure AD Premium. Only a single user per device is supported and only works with what are called enlightened apps. So those apps are the ones that are specifically written for controls, right? That's a very similar situation to iOS and Android. If you are using the MDM method, then Windows Information Protection works with any app at all. As I mentioned, 16-bit, 32-bit store app, does not matter. We can manage that app. And one note, only MDM can actually manage the BitLocker, that should be CSP, but either way, policies. So both MAM, which is user targeted, and MDM device policy can be assigned. Well, I said that confusing. You can apply MAM, user targeted policy, MDM device policy, device targeted policy in Windows Information Protection. If you're using MDM policy, it's going to be applied to devices joined to Azure AD. If you have a user on their personal device, then perhaps MAM policy would be preferred. So either of those. And then you can configure, you will need to configure in either case the MDM, well, if you're using an MDM joined device, then, well, let me back into it this way. So in order to manage a device for MDM, for MAM, then you're going to need to go into Azure AD mobility settings and make sure that Intune, in the case of our discussion today, is chosen as the MDM MAM authority, right? And so in that app, you will have two sections. You can configure the MDM settings and the MAM settings, and I'll show you that in a minute, right? And typically you would leave those as default, except for specifying groups of users that would actually be in scope. And again, I'll talk to you about that in a minute, but you do have to have that in order for this to work. In terms of scenarios now, really just a few, right? So you can, with Windows Information Protection, designate content as either work or personal. Now, there's two ways to do that. The way that you're going to see in the lab is I'm going to do it manually. And again, the reason I'm going to do it manually is, one, to show you, and two, because of the way that I have the demo kind of configured, which you'll see in a minute. You can also have this done automatically. So there are certain configurations you can introduce where apps that you have designated to be managed will know that when they're saving data or working with data located in certain places, that by default is going to be work data, corporate data. I'll give you an example real quick. So if you have a managed app that is saving data to OneDrive for Business, then in every case of that managed app saving data to OneDrive for Business, we're going to know that OneDrive for Business, because of what it is, business, is corporate data. And so we're going to save that data and mark it as corporate data. If we're working with files from OneDrive for Business, we're going to know that that is corporate data, and we're going to treat it as such, right? Now, you do have a choice to be able to manually interact with this and designate accordingly, and then we'll treat it the way that you say, and so on. But you'll see that more, and it'll make more sense whenever you see it in the lab in a minute. So being able to encrypt enterprise data is a scenario. So it's not just about necessarily protecting copy and paste or different things. We're actually going to encrypt the data on the device. And so there's protections around that, where you might try to move data from your device to another share somewhere, to a USB stick, to whatever it is off the device. There's protections that will kick in. There's encryption that kicks in to help protect that. Being able to do remote wipe of enterprise data. Now, I'm not talking about wiping the device here. I'm talking about wiping the data on the device that is data protected because it's corporate data, enterprise data. Absolutely possible. And then, again, being able to apply protections to specific apps that you know will be used to access corporate data. So again, you'll see all of this in a minute. And we'll start now. So in terms of configuring Windows Information Protection, let me show you how that can be done. And to do that, let me pull in Intune. And so notice, first of all, so this is the first session I've done, the first recorded session I've done since we announced, little tangent here, since we announced that the rebranding of Config Manager and Intune into a common branding called Microsoft Endpoint Manager, right? And so here is the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. This is a console where we can access all of the Intune stuff that we might want to configure. Now, certain things we'll still need to go and look at. Here's the dashboard and different things, so we might still need to go and look at the Azure portal for getting to certain things like Azure Active Directory. So I'll start here, right? Well, and let me continue on that tangent for a minute. One thing people ask, and this is as of today when I'm recording this, and this will develop over time. I'm recording this not too far from when we announced Microsoft Endpoint Manager at Ignite. Microsoft Endpoint Manager really is just a rebranding to unify Intune and Config Manager. Both of them will be under the Microsoft Endpoint Manager umbrella, right? And the idea is use both of them together to achieve the results that you need. One is not necessarily preferred over the other. It's just tools that you have from both sides to be able to manage your devices. And that story will get better and more defined as we go forward. But right now, a really good indication of what Microsoft Endpoint Manager changes are is this new console that kind of brings all of the things that we might want controls together in one place, and we'll begin to see some changes happening in this console. And anyway, I'll stop there, but I just wanted to call that out real quick. Okay, so the first thing that I mentioned that you have to configure, make sure is there, is the MDM MAM Provider. So if I go under Azure Active Directory and look, I have MAM or in Mobility, MDM and MAM right here. And then I have my Intune. I could add an application. That's where you would find Intune. And so in Intune, I have MDM and MAM. So on the MDM side, the only real configurable thing that you need to decide is the users who will be allowed to enroll in MDM. And so this is typically a configuration that you would have when those users log into, join their device to Azure AD the first time. This plugin here will automatically join their device to Intune. If the device is already joined into whatever, you can configure this here, the user scope. What set of users log in to or join their device to Azure AD do you want them to join into Intune? I said that very poorly. I will say it again. So this MDM setting where you're specifying the user scope is just simply to say when a user that is in the scope, in my case all, or I could scope it to a particular group. If I have a user that falls into the user scope that joins their device to Azure AD, right, the first time, then this control will take over and also enroll that device in Intune, right? These URLs are ones that you should generally not mess with. These are default, and the default are great for Intune. Then you have similar down here for MAM. And so if you have a device that is going to be a MAM-only device, then you have the same kind of controls as to which users you want to allow to participate in MAM, and then the URLs that you might want them to have to facilitate MAM. Now again, these are default, and I've never run across a reason to change these, so that's what I was referring to whenever I said MAM plus MDM controls in Azure AD. I feel like I was a little bit confusing on that, but hopefully it makes sense. So in terms of configuring Windows Information Protection Policy, let's go back over to our Endpoint Manager Intune console. And as we approach this, I just want to call out one thing, right? So we've done the discussion on iOS and Android. Whenever we went into the Intune settings, app protection policy, to configure MAM for iOS and Android, a few of the things, well, at least one thing that you were able to configure, things like PIN, things like copy and paste, the specific ways that data will be allowed to be used on these managed apps. You're not going to see any settings in the Windows Information Protection Policy configuration that will allow you to state whether you want, for example, copy and paste to be allowed on corporate enterprise data. That's all built into the operating system. That's all going to happen for you by default. What you're going to do here is just simply configure enabling Windows Information Protection, and then the mode of operation and a few little odds and ends like that, right? So I'm in the portal. So let me go to Apps, and then under App Protection Policies, we can go Configure what those policies would be. So I've got a couple configured here, one for the demo. I'll go ahead and create a policy. And I'm going to specify this is a Windows 10 policy, right? So what I would do here is just provide the name. I'll call it demo. A description if I want to, that's optional. The platform I've already chosen because I just selected it. And then the enrollment state, with or without enrollment. So again, without enrollment requires an enlightened app or only works with enlightened apps on the device. With enrollment means the entire device is protected because it's built into Windows and the device is MDM enrolled. So once I do this, and you'll notice that the list of options is the same. If it's without enrollment, then we just give you a blurb here, right? But with enrollment is what I will use. So the first thing we have to choose is protected apps. So these specifically will be the apps that must adhere to the Windows Information Protection Policy, right? So if I go into protected apps, there's 3 levels of apps. I can just click on add apps and you'll see from the drop down here, there's 3 levels. There's recommended apps, there's store apps, and there's desktop apps. Let me explain those real quick, then I'll show them to you. So recommended apps, these are ones that are pre-configured applications that you might want to protect or that commonly IT wants to protect. That does not mean that the protection is limited to just these apps. These are the recommended ones. These are ones that you can look at and kind of understand how things are configured. So you can see Edge here. You can see information for the product name, this type of app, the publisher, and so on. Let me just hover over it. You see the publisher is a long string of detail. The action here, you can also specify the file, minimum, maximum version. All of these aren't required, as you can tell, but we give you the ability to be as specific as you need to be to flag a given app for protection. You can scroll on down, you can see more. You can scroll down, you can see some desktop apps. So here's IE11, and we're just using an asterisk as a wildcard to specify, maybe we don't need to or want to specify the publisher, just use a wildcard. IE11 published by Microsoft, so a wildcard is okay there. The type of app it is, again, the publisher detail, the file name specifically, and again, asterisks here, and so on, right? So I'll show you how to do this in just a second, but this is what you get from the recommended apps. Then you also have store apps, right? Now, so let me show you an example of this. So you'll notice you have to fill this out, right? If you have a store app, you're going to need to specify the details for the store app. Oh, let me also show you this. If I go to recommended apps, here are the store apps, and you see file, minimum, maximum version. These fields don't exist when you're defining a store app. So if I go to store app, you'll see that there is no file name, minimum, maximum version. It's just these 3 blanks that you would need to fill out, right? For desktop apps, those other fields do exist, and you can optionally fill those out, right? Okay, so I'm going to use an example here for a store app. Specifically, I'm going to use Power BI, right? So for that, the name of the app would be Microsoft Power BI, right? And then the publisher would be, let me type this for a minute, CN equals Microsoft. So CN stands for Microsoft Corporation. CN stands for common name, and then O equals Microsoft Corporation, organization, and then L equals Redmond, so L is location, and then S equals Washington, so that's the state, and then C equals US is the country, right? And then product name, this is a specific product name that you would have to get off of the store app, so Microsoft Power BI for Windows. And then the action would be allow, right? And so then I could go hit OK. That would show up in the list, and I'm good to go. If I have several of these that I want to add, then I could just hit the ellipse, and we would have another blank, and I could add all of these together if I want to. So you see that I have the name, the publisher, the product name. So before I can add detail about a store app into this field or this form, I need to be able to obtain the publisher and the product name detail. Let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to go to businessstore.microsoft.com, Microsoft.com. All right, and I'm working with Power BI, so I need to go find Power BI in the business store. Oops, need to sign in real quick. It's going to take care of that for me, it looks like. All right, so signing in, and then I'm going to go find my store, and I know that I have Power BI here. Here it is. So I'm going to click on Power BI, and the reason I'm doing this in the store is I need to find the unique ID of Power BI in the store. The unique ID is right here on the URL, right? This is an ID that uniquely describes Power BI in the Windows Store, Microsoft Store for Business. Right, or Microsoft Store. So I'm going to paste that, copy that to my clipboard, Control C, and I'm going to use that again. So that's all I need to get to the store, Microsoft Store for Business to do. Now I need to go and obtain the detail that I'm looking for from that specific app. So to do that, I'm going to open another URL page, and I'm going to navigate to HTTPS and then bspmts.mp.microsoft.com. In fact, looks like I already have it here. So I will make sure V1 public catalog retail products, and then I'm going to put in just the URL, or I'm sorry, just that ID of the machine, right? And then app locker data. Because this is what's going to show me the detail I want. This is going to give me the JSON that I want. So just make a note of this particular URL, and you're going to just always replace this section with the ID of the specific app you want, in this case, Power BI, right? So the publisher is represented by package certificate name right here. So this is the publisher detail that you saw me put in. Right there, right? And then the name of the product is right here, package identity name. You saw me put this in for the name of the Power BI product whenever I loaded it into Intune. So that's all. That's how I do that. I don't need anything else. I'm good here. So all of that detail translated through. So that's adding a store app. Now, you might want to add a desktop app, because that is another item. I'm going to have to close that. Stand by, close. Okay. Here, we go back to protected apps, add. And now for desktop apps. So I have the same kind of ability to add a desktop app. Here you see the file, the min maximum version, if you want to add that. Right? Now, you don't have to supply all of it. You need to supply enough to be able to identify the app you care about, right? So there are some things to call out and kind of to understand about this. So you can actually go through and put asterisks in all of these fields, and that's certainly not recommended, certainly possible. If you did that, then all files that are signed by any publisher would then be subject to Windows Information Protection Policy and could be configured, right? But better would be to go through and configure just the fields you need. For example, you might want to just configure the publisher field. Well, if you just configure the publisher field, then all of the files signed by that particular publisher will be accepted and will be protected. So if you know that your company, for example, is the publisher of your app and is signed, then go for it. You know, that might be a good one. Or you might do publisher and then name only, right? And so the result of that is all files that are for the specified product and signed by the name publisher will be protected. And then you have combinations of publisher name and file only, and publisher name and file and minimum version only, and all sorts of things. You kind of get the idea, you know, as I go through this, how that works. So anything you want to do. The key to it, though, is that you need to get the publisher detail for a particular app if you are going to include it here. So let me show you as an example of how to do that for WordPad. So I'm just going to go into PowerShell and run this as admin. Run this as admin. Cool. And then use a simple commandlet, get app locker file information and dash path. And I should have navigated differently, but let's just do this. C:\Windows /system32 WordPad.exe. And I'm going to run that. Oops. I'll just point to Notepad. I know it's in there. Notepad. Okay. So this commandlet will go through and grab that, and here's the publisher detail that you need, right? And it ends with, pardon me, C=US. That it's just this part that's the publisher ID, but that's what you need, right? Now, again, you can add multiple apps by clicking on the ellipsis there, no problem. You could also actually go configure in XML multiple applications that you might want to add here. And then you could use the import option here instead of manually configuring through the UI in Intune. So how would you go do that? Well, I'll just show you really quick. I'm going to launch local security policy, there it is, and go look at a couple of things just real quick. All right, so I have local security policy up here. And so I'm going to go into application control policies, and then I'm going to go into app locker, and then packaged app roles. Packaged app rules. And I'm just going to kick off the wizard, create a new rule. All right. So we'll have to go through and fill all this out, but so before you begin, and then the next section, in terms of permissions, I want to allow permissions to the app. I want to define the user and or group that is going to have permissions to the app. Again, this kind of lines up with those boxes that I just showed you in the Intune UI. And then I'm going to go select under the Publisher tab how I want to go grab the details. So I could either use an installed packaged app as a reference, or an app installer as a reference. In this case, I'm just going to use this top one and select. And so it's going to bring up a list. Come on. Of apps that I can choose from. There it is. All right, so I'm going to go find the app or apps that I want. So let me just go click a couple, whatever. All right, and hit OK. And so I have the detail about the app publisher, any publisher, whatever the case may be, that I want to use. And I can go forward from here. Now, use custom values if you want to. There's some things you can do there, but I don't care for it right now. So I'm going to go forward and click Next. And then on the Exceptions tab, I'm really not going to do anything because I don't need to. And I would click Next, and I would export or create this policy. And what would happen is the policy would get created in an XML. So let me just go ahead and save this for a minute, and I'll go look at it. So I have it created here, right? Now I would need to export it, so I can do that by going back to App Locker, right-click, Export Policy, and just save it somewhere. I'll put this on the desktop, just App Locker, and export it. And so we are good. Let me go open up that policy for just a minute. I'm opening up on a separate screen, but let me grab it for a second. Hang on a second. All right, so here's the App Locker policy. I'm gonna open it with Notepad just to have it in front of us. And here it is, right? So here's just that sample App Locker policy file that I created. and you again have your publisher name, your binary version, different things, right, in here. And so just as an example, right? All right. Now, so that's creating the app logger policy for apps that are out there that you might want to control. Now, there's another section of this as well that we might want to look at, and that would be creating an executable rule for apps that are assigned. You could do the same thing. Here's executable roles, for apps, and you can kind of walk through the same wizard and create your new role and so on, whether you want to allow, what groups, publisher, path, file name, right? So you can go through here and create the rules for even unsigned apps. So there's signed apps, there's unsigned apps. So anyway, I show that to you just to introduce an option, how you could do some things. Definitely you'll want to mess with this and play around with it, but those are tools that you can use to ultimately populate any app that you might want for management, assuming the device is MDM managed, right? Okay, so all of that was getting the list of protected apps. Once we have the list of protected apps populated, then we're going to choose whether we want to exempt any apps at all from the policy. So whatever apps you want to always allow to bypass the Windows Information Protection restrictions, those are the ones that you would put here, right? So in this case, I'm not going to add any here. In my demo, I do have one added. I'll show you. And then finally, required settings. So these are settings that you have to have, right? So here's what I was referring to in terms of Windows Information Protection mode. How is this going to operate? So by default, we're turned off, right? But ultimately, you'll want to decide how you want this to run. So you can use silent if you like. So look at this, you'll see. You can use silent if you like. So basically, the user's free to do whatever they want. You just have logging that takes place so that we can review what the user has done. Now, this one, again, as I mentioned, is one I would primarily consider to test the settings that are configured to make sure that you're not going to have chaos whenever you implement them, that they're doing what you want them to do. So that's there. You can allow overrides, which means that we'll warn the user. Ultimately, the user can do what they want to do if they choose to go forward, but we definitely will warn and we will log. Or you can block, and that means that the action the user is trying to do, they won't even get prompted. They will just be denied, right, from doing that. They'll see that they're denied, but they won't have a choice to bypass. The other thing here that's critical is the corporate identity. So the corporate identity is typically going to be the primary internet domain. This is going to be used by Windows Information Protection to identify and tag corporate data. So for example, emails that might be sent with the corporate identity in scope, we'll know then that those are corporate emails, right? Intune automatically determines your corporate identity for you. You can go through and you can change this. You can edit it if you like. You may actually be in a place where you need to add additional corporate identities, and you can do that in the advanced settings section, which I'll show you. But here, just make sure that this is your primary corporate identity and go forward. Then finally, in advanced settings, we get to add additional things. So for example, network perimeter. This is where it really is flexible, and it's really up to you to decide how you want things to work. So the network perimeter simply means those areas on the network where you want data that is in that area to be considered corporate, to be considered protected. So let me pause here for just a minute. Windows Information Protection is not a blanket protection no matter where the data that's being accessed is located. A specific example that I called out earlier. So I mentioned that data that's in OneDrive for Business will always be protected. That is true, right? But that data that is on your desktop is not protected at all, right? Because the decision really is that if you have data on your desktop that's kind of more of a personal area, And so the data on your desktop is not protected. Now, maybe you want it to be, though, right? And so one thing that you could choose to do, and this example just to help you understand it, right? You could decide to redirect places like the desktop and other profile kind of locations to OneDrive for Business. And people do that. And if you do redirect a user's desktop to OneDrive for Business, then guess what? That data is now in OneDrive for Business, and anything saved there and marked there will be considered corporate data. So it's some of these things that you just have to think through as you're setting this up. Other things, you might have other domain names or other IP ranges or other internet locations that you want to make sure data coming from and going to those locations are considered work data. And you have that option here when you define network boundaries. Network boundaries. Let me show you. So if you go and add, you have several options. You have cloud resource. They just drop down. You have cloud resources. So this might be a place that you would go configure a URL to SharePoint. So if you have SharePoint sites where you're storing data that's corporate, then you can flag those locations here by entering the URLs for SharePoint. Right, and there's documentation on how to do that, and you can enter multiple of them and so on. So I won't go into that here, but just FYI. There's also protected domains, and so this might be where you would do Outlook Web Access or something of that nature. You can have network domains. This would be maybe local domains like corp.contoso.com and then region.contoso.com, but then public.contoso.com you might not want to include there, so you would not add it. Then you have proxy servers that you might want to add and decide whether those data coming in and out of those proxy servers is protected. You have internet proxy servers and IP4 ranges and IP6 ranges and so on, right? You hopefully get the idea here. So once you configure that and decided this is a critical piece, again, not required, it's not under required settings, but it is a very useful area of settings. Once you have that configured, then there's other ones here as well. So enterprise proxy servers is authoritative. So if you define your enterprise proxy servers, then you can decide, hey, is that the list that is authoritative, that's what you always want to use as your proxy list, or do you want Intune or Windows Information Protection to go out and kind of go discover others, right? Auto detect others. If you say no, off, then we're going to go we're going to use your list as authoritative. If you say, sorry, I'm getting that wrong. If you say off, then we're going to be able to go discover automatically. If you say on, then we're going to consider your list authoritative. Same thing for IP ranges here. If your list is authoritative, we won't go try to auto-detect, but if it's not, then we will. Here you have data protection. So this is optional, but strongly recommended. When you have Windows Information Protection enabled, then files will be encrypted if they are seen as containing corporate data, which is great, right? If, though, at some point something happens and the encryption key for those files is lost on the local machine, then those files will be forever and ever locked and encrypted, and it would be challenging to open them up and get the data back, which is why we have the ability to configure a data recovery agent, which is a certificate to allow recovery of data in those scenarios. So configuring a data recovery agent certificate is not hard. You can go use Cypher as a way to do that and go see on the web how to actually create and verify an EFS DRA certificate. And we walk you through how to do that. Really not hard. Good idea, really important idea, strongly recommended to have that in place. Other settings, prevent corporate data from being accessed by apps when the device is locked, if you want to do that. Revoke encryption keys when the device unenrolls, if you want to do that. Show the enterprise data protection icon. This is off by default. Strongly suggest turning it on, because the icon of the app that is protected will change when it is actually containing corporate data and being protected. Other things, use Azure RMS for Windows information protection, right? And that just enables the two to work kind of side by side. Allow Windows search other extensions, so you can define other extensions that you might want to make sure are encrypted. We do encrypt a number of extensions by default. The list eludes me at the moment, but this gives you that ability to know exactly what type of extensions are being encrypted in your environment. So if you want to do .txt, .doc, .ppt, whatever it is that you want to encrypt, automatically you're able to do that, right? And so these are the configurations. Again, notice you saw nothing in here about enable copy and paste, prevent data from leaving a device, whatever the configurations are, because that's all built in to Windows information protection and happens automatically, right? Okay. So let me go show you this actually working, all right? I'll walk you through real quick a protection policy that I have created for this, for demo. So I did with enrollment. We'll look at that. So I have my protected apps. I have a few of them, right? Notepad, IE11, OneNote, all of these are apps that are protected, meaning these are apps that are allowed to access and expected to access corporate data. I've exempted my company portal app, right? So it's not subject to the Windows information protection policies at all, right? In terms of required settings, I've set allow overrides, and this is my corporate identity, and the only advanced setting, I think I have one for SharePoint. Yeah, I just put that in here. I'll just show it to you real quick as an example. Here's how you might configure SharePoint. Notice the bar that separates between, right there, the bar that separates between the two entries. But that's the only one I put in there kind of as just an example of how to do it. The only other setting I did was down here, show the enterprise data protection icon. So that's enabled, right? That was me turning on Windows information protection policy. I have assigned this to users and devices just to have coverage, but the main thing I care about is my user right here is going to be subject to Windows information protection policies, okay? So now let me pull in my Windows device and show you this in action. Again, some of the things that you would want to do probably in your environment I am not doing, such as configuring network boundaries and so on, which is why the demo is going to work the way I'm going to show you. But let me log in. Okay. So what I have here is just a standard Windows 10, I think this is 1909 desktop, and I want to work with some work files, so some files, right? So I'm just going to open up work files, and I'm going to create, you see I've messed with this already, I'm going to go create a file. I'm going to create, let me just create a new file, new text file. All right, so demo.txt. So this is a text file. It is out here, has no data in it at all, but I can go look at properties of this file. I can go look at advanced. I can go see this option, which is not even available to me, right? Which would show me whether or not the file itself is encrypted. It is not encrypted because currently this file is marked as a personal file. The reason I know it's marked as a personal file is it does not have this icon change. Now, I can go change this, no problem. In fact, I will. Let me go right click on this and go to file ownership, and I'm going to set this as work. Now, let me just say, the way that you know Windows information protection, one of the ways you know that Windows information protection policy is applied to your device is you have this file ownership option available to you. If Windows information protection policy is not applied, then you won't have the ability to change file ownership. So I'm going to go change and make this a work file. You notice that the icon has changed. It is now indicating it is protected. So now if I go back into properties and I go back into advanced, notice that I do have the details option available. Now this is obviously an empty file. If this is a big file, it might take a couple of minutes to encrypt it, whatever, but ultimately you would have this option available and you would see what enterprise domain can remove or revoke access, and you can definitely see that this file is protected, right? So that's just a quick quick and dirty little example of how the differences show up between files that are protected as work and those that are protected as personal. All right. Now, let me show you another example. So Notepad is one of my protected apps. Okay. So Notepad, I'm just going to put in some text, test. And then I'm going to save onto my desktop here. So this is demo 2. Now, I'm saving this onto my desktop. Because of my current configuration, me saving this is just going to save this as a personal file. If I were to save this to OneDrive for Business, then it would be always work, right? That's the one thing that you really have no control over. OneDrive for Business is always work, but I don't have OneDrive for Business set up on this PC. It's, again, my lab is kind of weird. That's why. Otherwise, I would show you that. But I'm going to save it here, right? So I've got this saved, no problem. It's out here. It is saved as personal. Why? Because I'm on the desktop right now. Work files folder is on the desktop, so the desktop is not an area that is protected, right? Could be if I redirect to OneDrive, but I haven't done that. And so I'm going to go and change this, right? And mark it as a work file. Okay, cool. So now that I've done that, it's going through the process of being encrypted and so on. Now, one of the things I want to show you is how the data that is marked as work is protected from non-corporate approved apps. So here's Notepad. Here's my text. I'm going to go and launch WordPad. So WordPad was not on the list of protected apps, apps that are allowed to access corporate data. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to try to paste it into Word. Notice what happens. I get warned. Are you sure that you want to use work content here? Right? I'm not being blocked because I have not configured to block. I've configured to allow override, so I can say yes, I can go ahead and do that. In fact, I will say yes, and this will be logged, right? And so, interesting, right? That your organization doesn't allow that. So even though I'm allowed to override, still, this is not a protected app at all, and so I don't get the data here that I want. Instead, I'm warned, right? So that's an example of user experience. Now, another one, let's say that I have, and notice also that I can tell that I'm being protected because I have kind of a briefcase up here, and it is managed, and it's telling me who's managing it, so I can see that. It kind of is a visual indicator too, and I'll close that. Now, let's say that I'm getting ready to go home, and I have a particular doc that I'm working on, and I want to copy it off to a thumb drive or a different network share or whatever, right? So I have a network share here. Say that I want to copy it off to a network share. Okay, fine, I want to work on this later. I'm just going to copy it. There's no nefarious intents at all, but I'm just going to go down here, and I'm going to hit Control-V, and notice, well, I don't know that I copied it. Copy it, Control-C, and then Control-V. There. Copying one file, and I'm getting warned. You can't place work-protected content in this location, right? Do I want to continue? I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to be allowed to complete the copy, right? But I'm definitely going to have that logged as well, right? So I'm just going to get rid of it because I don't care. Notice that it's on the remote share. In this case, it's not protected any longer, right? But that's the kind of user experience that I just wanted to show you. Again, I don't have any of the additional things that would actually be more relevant in a corporate environment, such as setting network boundaries so that things happen more automatically, but that gives you a good sense of how this works, right? Let me pull this out for a second. One of the things I also want to show you is kind of in the troubleshooting section, really not troubleshooting so much, though it is kind of along the lines of troubleshooting, more tips and tricks. Oops. Log back in. Come on, let me back in. Okay, that was weird. How can we track this? Well, there's a couple of different ways that we can, and they're event viewer based. And this is where if you're logging actions, you know, kind of in silent mode. You're wanting to check how things are working. You can certainly review them here, and whatever the purposes are, you can certainly see what's going on here. So I'm going to go into Applications and Services Logs. I'm going to go into Microsoft, and then Windows, and then there's two areas. We'll just go there. There's EDP, are the sections. EDP, EDP Audit Regular and EDP Audit TCB, right here and right here. So let me open those up. And so anything, you know, these are the areas where we will track. So let's just look at Audit Regular, right? So here we will see things about what has happened, you know, and different actions that take place so that you can track what's going on and so forth. And similarly, down here, we'll see actions that have taken place and on files and so on. So this is a good location to at least be able to tell what's going on, right? So this is similar, certainly in terms of MAM in some ways. This is the way that we implement it on Windows today. You know, who knows if we'll tweak this and change it a bit in the future, but certainly this is available to you today in Windows 10. Definitely take a look at it. This will help you achieve the same kind of protections, different ways that you do it for sure, but same kind of protections that you might want and let you implement for iOS and Android. And so that's why I wanted to show it to you, but we will wrap the session here, and we will see you next time.